So in the early 80s, it was a great time in motorcycle manufacturing. Now, when you look at the 80s, they weren't afraid to make some funky designs. Suzuki had their Katana and Kawasaki had the GPz. But is the Kawasaki a good classic bike? And if I'll be honest, calling Kawasaki a classic bike is really upsetting to me because I had one when I was a teenager and it was only a few years old. But I've got to remember, if Back to the Future was filmed today, they'd be going back to the 90s. So being an 80s bike, they're now entering classic recognition. Hey everyone, welcome to Roads of Oz. My name is Matt and on this episode we're looking at the Kawasaki GPz 750. Now the Kawasaki GPz was initially released in 1982 as a replacement to the Z750 and it had a simple bikini fairing and a couple of engine upgrades. It wasn't until 1983 that it took on the classic GPz 750 shape. The chassis was modified to accommodate the Unitrack monoshock suspension. For me, the fairing's a bit Darth Vader inspired in its shape, but it definitely screams Kawasaki of the era. And that's something I loved about the 80s. The Japanese manufacturers wanted their bikes to stand out from the crowd, to be instantly recognized. And unlike today, where they pretty much all bikes look the same, these stood out as being quite unique. Being a unique bike doesn't always mean good, but let's have a look at what makes this bike unique and quite a bit of fun to own. So when this one came out, it had an air-cooled 738cc motor, cracks out about 60 kilowatts at 65.8 Newton meters. Coupled up to a 5-speed transmission, the motor itself is quite UJM in a lot of ways. What isn't UJM is its cool little secondary dash, which gives fuel, battery meter, and a couple of other warning lights like side stand and also oil level. The front forks have an air and oil combination and they've got anti-dive suspension. We'll get to that a bit later. Now the rims are 18-inch front and rear and it's got about a 230 kilogram weight. Now the first year of the bike, as I said, it was a bikini style fairing only. In 83 to 84 they come out with a full-size upper fairing, is what you see here. And from 84 onwards, they had a taller handlebar with an internal plastic to stop, to hide the wiring and also prevent the light coming, bouncing back up. And by 85, they introduced a lower fairing. This bike was eventually replaced by the water-cooled GPz 750R, but back in the day, this was classed as a sports bike and they were raced and they were ridden quite hard. Now, there is even a turbo version, which is very collectible, but this review is going to focus wholly and solely on the normally aspirated 750cc motor. So we'll start with the good points. Well, it's quite a unique look and you don't see many of these out on the road anymore. Principally because they were pretty much ridden into the ground. Now, this suffered the same as every other sports bike that gets old. And what happens is when the first owners get them, they can normally afford the maintenance schedule. As these bikes get older and they get more affordable, the people that tend to buy them probably don't have the same maintenance budget. To run these bikes will probably almost cost as much as the purchase price, and you'll find a lot of corners are being cut to maintain. By today's standard, it's not that fast, and it's amazing how my perception has changed over time. When I first had one of these bikes in 1993, riding one, it felt like being fired out of a cannon. It felt very fast. But after owning much more modern bikes, faster bikes, the acceleration on this, it isn't exactly frightening, which isn't a bad thing, but acceleration is quite linear and it's very predictable, which is not such a bad thing when you think about it. Handling, well, it's a 230 kilo bike hooked up the suspension that was designed back in the 70s and early 80s. So it feels a bit heavy, but overall, for a tall guy like me, I feel quite comfortable on it. I do like the seating position. Even though the handlebars are clip-ons, I feel quite comfortable riding it and could put in a solid day riding it without any real problems. Now, issues. Well, we'll start with the minor issues. Now, there's been a lot of reports of starter clutch issues, and that means, it just spins without engaging the motor. It's a simple repair and it shouldn't be overly expensive. Now, another issue is you can no longer get the batteries that these bikes require. And what I mean by that, back in the day, there was a little connection for the battery that would monitor the water level or electrolyte level on the battery, and when it got low, you'd get the alarm up. Those batteries are no longer made, but it's a simple mod to bypass that warning light, and you still get the good startup function, but it just doesn't show a low battery level, which is quite good because most batteries are sealed units anyway. Now, another issue is the tyre availability. Of course, it's an 18-inch tyre front and rear. Modern rubber's a 17-inch. Getting tyres is quite the challenge. You are limited in what you can get, and in most cases people just take what they can get, and that can have other adverse effects. In this case, the tyre profile is a bit lower, so we put the speedo out by about 20 kilometres an hour. Is it an issue for me? Well, not really, because all I do is just use a speedometer app that uses GPS, and that gives me a much more accurate speed reading anyway. Now, the major issue, well, because this bike was only produced between 83 and 85, a lot of the unique parts to it are becoming very rare and hard to find, and in some cases they're no longer being produced. So things like the fairing are getting hard to find. Now, not that it's an issue, it's probably cheaper to get the fairing repaired and resprayed at a good panel beater than what it is to try find one in good condition. The rocker cover is prone to leak, and especially when they put something like air pod filters on and they remove the air breather hose and just put a bolt in it. Big mistake, it just puts pressure on the motor, and path of least resistance, you'll find that will create the rocker cover gasket leak becoming more prominent. Now, the big one for me is the anti-dive suspension. Now, this wasn't great in the early 80s. By the time the 90s come around, most people have bypassed it, and my bike is no different. Even though it's got all the anti-dive there, I've had the forks rebuilt and they're leaking yet again. And this is predominantly because of the anti-dive. Now, there is a simple solution. You can upgrade the springs, and also you can get a bypass system and remove the anti-dive, which is what I will be doing in the future. But it's something to be fully aware of. The anti-dive system on the Kawasaki's, it looks really complex, and it's really just another point of failure. Ideally, I'd just bypass and get rid of it. Even though there's not a massive amount of aftermarket support for these bikes, if you dive deep enough, you can pretty much find whatever you're looking for. In the case of the anti-dive, there's actually a company that produces a stem that you can put an aftermarket front end like a GSXR 600, 750 or 1000, and you can bolt it straight on by replacing the factory stem, and it will bolt straight in. There'll be a link to this description and that below. And like I said earlier, there's a bypass kit for the anti-dive, and realistically, 40-year-old suspension, probably time to freshen it up and put in new springs anyway, so it's a good opportunity to get your front fork sorted. So what's it like to ride around town? I haven't ridden this bike as much as I'd like due to the front fork issues, and that's more my problem than the bike. These bikes are designed to be ridden, and leaving them sit in the garage, they're gonna develop more problems in the long term. I tried using it as a daily rider, but broke my finger, so I can't ride for the next few weeks, but whenever I have been riding it, I've found the bike more than willing. It's still quick enough to stay ahead of traffic, and it is a lot of fun to ride. It does get that typical air-cooled bike smell. It smells, you get that metallic smell in the air, and my advice is don't park it straight to the garage if the garage is connected to the house. I generally leave it outside, let it cool down, then bring it in. Otherwise, the smell can get in the house and really pisses off my wife. Like I said earlier, these GPz 750s, they were mass produced for about 3 to 4 years, but they still weren't really the hero bike of the time. There was a GPz 750 Turbo, there's an Eddie Lawson replica, which is the Z1000. The GPz 1100 even has more cachet. So the 750, even though it was classed as a sports bike, they were pretty much ridden to oblivion. So finding a good one is quite the challenge. But if you do, they're not commanding a great deal of money. I've seen one sitting on Marketplace, which looks in far better condition than this one, being advertised for about $8 grand, and that's even before you negotiate. So prices for a classic 80s bike, I think they're spot on, especially when you're comparing them to the Katanas that are starting to reach upward of 20 grand. The problem is, these days they're a really niche bike. There's not a big market for them, but also people that want them are people like myself. In most cases, guys that have owned them have since moved on and there's no real nostalgia back to them. Unlike the Katana has a bit of a cult following. So these bikes don't have a massive following. They do have a loyal following and there's people that absolutely love them, but in more often than not, you're going to buy the bike cheap because it's going to be harder to sell later down the track. I can't see the 750 appreciating massively in value because during COVID, prices for all bikes went up. The prices that come down the quickest will be ones for bikes like this because they're just not as desirable as, say, something like a Katana or bevel Ducatis or things like that. Doesn't mean they're not a good bike, just means they're not going to be as popular and they're not going to be as easy to sell. So yes, if you're after a good entry-level classic Japanese 4, one of these should be on your radar. Parts for the motor are readily available. It's just you've got to be very careful of the parts that are unique to the bike. In saying that, I've loved owning it. Whenever I take it for a ride, it brings a smile to my face. I have no intention of selling this one anytime soon. In a matter of fact, I've been umming and ahhing on what sort of restoration to do, whether to just update the forks or whether to go the whole hog and put the newer forks, which will give me access to 17-inch tyres. But most likely, I'll probably just stick with what I've got and just freshen it up. Another bit of advice, I wouldn't buy one to restore. It'd be far cheaper to buy one that's been fully restored than actually buy a clapped out one and trying to restore it yourself. You'd well and truly blow the budget and it would have been much cheaper in the long run to actually buy one in good condition in the first place. Things like your GPz 750, if you bought a clapped out one, by the time you spent the money restoring it, you're gonna probably spend double of what you'd get if you actually sold it. Again, entirely up to you. If it's a passion project, not a problem. If it's just one you do out of interest, I wouldn't do it. That's pretty much it for me. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Definitely leave a comment below if you've owned one and what your experience was. I'd love to hear from you. Anyway, thanks for watching and I'll see you on the next vid.